The night it happened, I remember the exact sound the wind made against the bedroom window. A low hollow pressing. Like something outside wanted in and had all the patience in the world to wait. I was lying on my side with both hands pressed flat against my stomach, and I was trying to breathe in a way that didn't wake the baby in the cradle at the foot of our bed. I had been lying that way for a long time. Long enough that the candle on the nightstand had burned itself small. Long enough that the fire in the kitchen below had gone quiet. Long enough that I understood, somewhere in the part of me that had stopped pretending, that something was very wrong with my body, and that my husband Elias was still downstairs, and that he was not coming up. I want to tell you that I called out to him. I want to tell you that I said his name in the dark and that he heard it and that he came. But that is not what happened. And this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, has always been the place where I tell you what actually happened, even when what actually happened is the thing I spent years trying to unknow. My name is Clara. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small community in eastern Indiana. I was married at 20. I left at 27. And what I am going to tell you tonight is the story of the night I understood, fully and without any more room for doubt, what a wife was for in the world I had been raised inside. If that is the kind of truth you are here for, stay with me. Subscribe and tap the like button and tell me in the comments, was there ever a night in your life when you needed someone and the silence answered instead? I need to tell you about Elias before I tell you what he did, because I have sat with enough anger and enough grief and enough of the hard work of trying to understand to know that the most honest thing I can give you is not a villain. The most honest thing I can give you is a man. Elias was 23 when we married. He was tall in the way that farm-raised men are tall, through the shoulders, through the stillness of him, the way he stood in a doorway as if the frame had been built around him specifically. He was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly, the way Lydia once said something clearly to me in a way I did not fully understand until much later. He was not cruel. He was formed. There is a difference. And it matters, and it took me years of sitting in a therapist's office in a city I had never imagined to understand that a man can fail you completely without ever once choosing to. In our community, a husband's responsibilities were drawn in lines so clear and so old that no one spoke them aloud anymore. They did not need to be spoken. A husband provided. He led. He made the decisions that concerned the family's welfare. He was the head, and the head did not worry itself with what the body felt. The body's feelings were the body's domain, and in the theology of our marriage, the body meant me. I had been taught this the way I had been taught everything, not as a rule but as the shape of the world. You do not question the shape of the world. You learn to move inside it. The first time I had understood that my pain was private happened 2 years before the worst night. I had been sick for 10 days with something that settled into my chest and would not leave. A deep, rattling sickness that made it hard to draw a full breath without stopping to cough. I still cooked every meal. I still hauled water. I still bent over the washboard until my hands were red and the steam from the tub made me dizzy. Because who else would do it? Because rest, in the language of our community, was not something a wife gave herself. Rest was something God gave you when the work was finished, and the work was never finished. On the 8th day, Elias came in from the barn and I was at the stove and I turned to carry his supper plate to the table and the room tilted hard to the left. I grabbed the edge of the counter. I stood there with my eyes closed and my knuckles white on the wood, and I heard him pull out his chair and sit down. He did not ask what was wrong. He bowed his head for the silent grace, and then he picked up his fork. I carried his plate to the table. I sat down across from him. I did not eat. He did not ask. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not when the doctor finally came 3 days later, the plain doctor our bishop approved, and told me I had walking pneumonia and that I needed to stay in bed for a week. Elias heard those words. He stood just inside the doorway of the bedroom with his hat in his hands and he listened to the doctor speak, and then he nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when someone told him a piece of farm equipment needed repairing. As if I were a thing that had broken and needed to be catalogued as temporarily out of service. That night, I lay in bed and I heard him downstairs making himself supper from what was in the cold cellar. I heard the children's voices, and then the sound of them being put to bed by my sister-in-law Ruth, who had come over for that purpose, and who spoke loudly and cheerfully about nothing important for an hour before she left. I heard the house settle into its quiet. And then I heard Elias's boots on the stairs. He came into the bedroom. He undressed in the dark. He lay down beside me. He did not touch me. He did not speak. Within minutes his breathing slowed into sleep. I lay awake beside him for a long time, listening to that sound, trying to feel something other than what I was feeling. Trying to find the gratitude the bishop always said a wife should carry. Trying to find the peace that came with submission. Trying, in the language of every sermon I had ever heard, to surrender. But underneath the trying, something else was moving. Something quiet and without a name. Something that felt, if I let myself touch it for just a moment before pulling my hand back, like the first crack in a wall I had not known I was leaning on. The night I am really here to tell you about happened 14 months later. I had lost a baby. Not a birth. Something before that, the kind of loss that happens in the body in the night and leaves a woman wrung out and silent in the morning. I had known something was wrong for 2 days beforehand. A wrongness that had no single location, just a diffuse, heavy, pulling feeling, the way the sky feels before a storm when the pressure changes and the animals go quiet. I had said nothing to Elias. Because you learned, inside our world, that saying something before there was something definite to say was a form of complaint. And complaint was a door for the devil, and I had spent my whole life making sure that door stayed shut. By the evening of the second day I knew. I went upstairs early. I told Elias I was tired, which was true, which was also all I knew how to say. He was in the kitchen with his accounts book, the ledger he kept for the farm, and he nodded without looking up. I climbed the stairs, holding the wall. What happened next I will not describe in detail. I will only tell you that by midnight, I was lying on the bedroom floor beside the bed, because lying in the bed had become impossible, and I had a quilt pulled over me that I had gotten myself, and both my hands were pressed flat against my stomach, and the candle was burning small on the nightstand. And Elias was downstairs. I knew he was there. I could hear, faintly, the creak of his chair, the occasional sound of the wood stove door. He was awake. He simply had not come up. I have asked myself many times in the years since what he knew and what he didn't. I have gone back and forth across that question the way you cross a frozen creek, testing the ice with every step, not fully trusting any of it. I do not know if he understood what was happening. I know that I had not told him. I know that in our world, a wife's body was not something a husband watched or tracked or worried over with the same vigilance he gave his livestock. That would have been strange. That would have been a different kind of marriage than any I had ever seen. What I know is that the door at the bottom of the stairs did not open. That is what I know. At some point I must have slept. When I woke, it was early gray light, and the baby in the cradle had begun to stir. The small huffing sounds that meant I had minutes before she would really wake. I lay on the floor for a moment looking up at the ceiling boards, and I took a slow inventory of my body the way you take inventory of a room after a storm, moving from corner to corner, noting what was broken and what still stood. Then I got up. I washed my face in the basin. I dressed. I went downstairs. Elias was already at the table. He looked up when I came in. He looked at my face for a moment with the expression he sometimes wore when something on the farm was not right. A brief, assessing look. And then he looked down at his coffee. He said, "You feeling better?" I said yes. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He went to the barn. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time after he left, watching him cross the yard in the early light, watching his shoulders, the steadiness of his walk, the way he moved through the world with the certainty of a man who had never once been asked to question the shape of it. And I felt something that I could not name then, and that I now understand was grief. Not for the baby I had lost, though that grief was also there, deep and private and entirely my own, but grief for something larger. For the version of my marriage I had spent years trying to believe in. For the story I had been told, the one about a wife's submission producing a husband's tenderness, the one where the surrender was always answered, eventually, with something worth surrendering for. That morning, standing at my kitchen window, I understood for the first time that the story had never been true. That it had been a useful story for the people who told it. And that I had been paying for it with my body, in the dark, alone. 3 days later, I was at a quilting at the bishop's wife's house. There were 7 of us around the frame, the kind of quilting where the conversation moves slowly and settles in comfortable patches, and no one says anything that needs to be remembered. An older woman named Miriam was seated across from me. She was perhaps 60, with the kind of face that looked like it had been through every season more than once, and had stopped being surprised by any of them. I did not know her well. She was from a neighboring district, visiting her daughter for the week. She had not spoken much all morning. At some point, the conversation drifted elsewhere, and it was just the two of us across the frame with our needles moving. And Miriam said, without looking up from her stitching, "You had a hard week." It was not a question. I did not ask how she knew. In a community that size, knowing moved through the air like weather. I said, "I am fine." She said nothing for a moment. She pulled her thread through the fabric and looked at the stitch, and then she said, still not looking at me, "I am going to tell you something that no one told me, and I want you to listen to the whole thing before you decide what to do with it." I put my needle down. She said, "The night I lost my second child, my husband slept through it. Not because he didn't know. I had told him. I had put my hand on his arm in the dark and I had said, 'Something is wrong with me.' And he said, 'Pray on it.' And he went back to sleep." She paused. She looked at her stitching. She said, "I told myself for 30 years that it was my fault. That I hadn't said the right words. That I hadn't made him understand. That a wife who is truly surrendered doesn't need her husband to come because God is enough. I told myself that story every way I knew how. I am telling you now, child, it was not my fault. And it is not yours. And what they have built here, this thing they call a marriage, it is not built for your worst night. It was never built for your worst night. It was built for his." She picked up her needle again. She said, "I'm not telling you to leave. I am not telling you to stay. I am only telling you that you are not wrong about what you felt on that floor. You are not wrong. A woman should not spend her worst night alone because there is a theology that gives her husband permission to let her." Then she went back to her stitching. And the other women drifted back to the frame. And the conversation resumed around us like water closing over a stone. I sat there with my hands in my lap, and I did not pick up my needle for a long time. I stayed for 4 more years after that quilting. I will not tell you those years were all bad, because that would not be true, and I have made a promise to myself and to you that I will not soften the truth in either direction. There were good days. There were mornings when the light came in low across the kitchen floor, and the children were eating, and Elias was reading, and the whole scene had a peace to it that I could feel in my chest, like something warm. I did not want to destroy that peace. I wanted to fold it up and put it somewhere safe and carry it with me. But I also learned in those 4 years what Miriam had meant. I watched myself move through the architecture of our marriage with new eyes, the way you see a house differently after someone points out where the foundation has settled. The theology that gave Elias permission not to come to me on my worst night was the same theology that made my opinion about our finances irrelevant, that made my tiredness an inconvenience and my body a resource, that made my grief something I processed alone on a kitchen floor while my husband balanced his ledger downstairs. It was not cruelty. That is the thing that is hardest to explain to people who grew up outside of it. It was not cruelty. It was a system that had been built so carefully over so many generations that it no longer needed anyone to be cruel. It ran on its own. It ran on verses and sermons and mothers who came with bread and women who sat beside you at quiltings and said, "A wife carries what she carries," and husbands who slept through your worst night, not because they didn't care, but because they had been handed a script that said caring about your wife's body was not their part to play. When I finally left, I took the children, and I took a suitcase, and I took Miriam's voice in my head saying, "You are not wrong about what you felt on that floor. I want to tell you what happened when I found language for it." Because for a long time after I left, I had the experience but I did not have the words. And without the words, it kept slipping sideways into self-doubt, into maybe I am remembering it wrong, into maybe I am being unfair to him, into maybe the problem was always me. My therapist was a woman about 15 years older than me, who had a plant on her windowsill that she watered during sessions when she was thinking. The first time I told her about the night on the floor, she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "That is called abandonment during vulnerability. And when it is patterned and supported by a system that normalizes it, it is a form of neglect." Abandonment during vulnerability. I had never heard those words in that order before. I said them back to her slowly, the way you sound out a word in a foreign language you are still learning. She gave me others over the following months. Conditional presence, coercive theology, structural coercion, the absence of consent when refusal carries unbearable cost. Each word landed somewhere specific, like a key finding the lock it was cut for. I had lived inside all of these things for years. I had moved through them every day. I had called them, in the only language I had, marriage. The work of leaving was not just the leaving. The work of leaving was learning to name what I had been inside. Because you cannot fully walk away from something you cannot see. And for a long time I could not see it because it had no edges. It was just the shape of the world. I think about Miriam sometimes. I do not know where she is now. She was visiting her daughter that week, passing through, and I never saw her again at any quilting. I sometimes wonder if she remembers that conversation. I wonder if she knows that she handed me something that morning that I carried for 4 years before I understood its full weight. She did not tell me to leave. She did not tell me my husband was a bad man. She did not tell me the community was wrong, or the theology was false, or that the life I was living was beneath me. She told me only one thing. She told me that I was not wrong about what I felt on that floor. That was all. And it was everything. Because the hardest part of being inside a system that is built to make you doubt yourself is not the system's cruelty. It is the way the system makes you its accomplice. The way it teaches you to look at your own wound and say, I must have done this to myself. The way it trains you to take your worst night and fold it into a lesson about your own failure to surrender. The way it makes the truth, when it finally comes, feel almost too simple to be real. You were not wrong about what you felt. Whatever floor you have been on, whatever dark you have moved through with both hands pressed flat, trying to hold yourself together while someone who was supposed to be there was not, you were not wrong. Not about the pain, not about the silence, not about what it meant. If this touched you anywhere real, I want to know. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you. Tell me if you have ever been on a floor like that, in the dark, counting your own breathing, waiting for a door that did not open. Tell me if you have your own Miriam, the woman who found you at the frame and told you the truth in a low voice, and then went back to her stitching. And if you want to keep hearing the stories that were never supposed to leave the room where they happened, subscribe to Amish Clara. There is so much more I have not yet said. Until next time, remember this. A wife's worst night is not a spiritual assignment. It is a night that deserves a hand in the dark. You deserve that hand. You always did.